If you're not super familiar with Ilford, but you're shooting film, then you should probably become more familiar with Ilford. They're very important. They make a lot of stuff: chemical, paper, film, more film, a variety of film, entirely black and white. When it comes to Ilford, they're kind of like really big popular films are HP5, which is a 400 ISO black and white film, and FP4, which is a 125 ISO film. Also, those films are technically called HP5 Plus and FP4 Plus, but usually people just call them FP4 and HP5. But they also have Ilford Delta 400 and Delta 100, which is easier to kind of look at and think, what is the big difference between like HP5 and Delta 400, FP4 and Delta 100? What it really comes down to is a different grain structure. So Ilford's Delta films have a finer grain in comparison to their Plus films, which have a more traditional kind of grain to them. So FP4 and HP5, which are Plus films, and Delta 100 and 400. It is very similar to, like a few weeks ago, I talked about T-Max and Tri-X from KODAK, and how T-Max is a T-grain film and Tri-X is a like traditional film. Ilford also gives like a decent little breakdown of this on their website for us. It uses Ilford Photo proprietary controlled core shell trademark crystal growth technology. Not the same as KODAK T-grain. I love how Ilford is like, you know how T-grain and T-Max is different from Tri-X with square grain? Well, it's core shell now, baby, and it's different. It's not T-grain. Core shell. Core shell crystals have carefully tailored sensitometric properties to ensure maximum detail is captured in highlights and shadows. It has a more uniform grain structure in comparison to like their Plus films of HP5 and FP4. Ilford is also kind enough to supply this very, very informative and high resolution image breakdown on their website. Good job. So if we're breaking it down to like the basic terms, it's pretty much kind of like T-Max and T-grain from, you know, what they kind of spell out for us. It's a different kind of grain from traditional kind of films, and it will give you sharper and finer grain results at higher ISOs in comparison to like traditional things. And just like T-Max, Delta is available in 100, 400, and 3200 ISO options. So yeah, it's soft shell, core shell trademark versus like T-grain. Also, the Delta films kind of need a more precise exposure, and they can be a little bit less forgiving in comparison to like the traditional grained Plus films of HP5 and FP4. So all this stuff developed, HC110, scanned here at home, V700 for the black and white stuff I do on the channel. That's how I consistently do it. You can see all the samples of this stuff over on the Patreon as well. I'm just gonna say it, and you can, whatever, everybody has different stances and opinions and what they're looking for in film, but I like Delta 100 more so than my experience shooting FP4 for the roll reviews. I was pretty surprised to see negatives come out of the tank that I really like the look of, and I always like a sharp, contrasty black and white film against flatter film stocks like Kentmere, for example. And Kentmere is also meant to be like a cheaper film that has a much flatter contrast and grainier look to it in comparison to Delta 100. As Ilford has recommended, you do want to pay good attention to your exposure with this stuff, and you can expect some solid contrast on your shots. But of course, you can start to tailor your own developing process around the results you want to maybe soften that characteristic of the film. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this contrasty. The big comparison, of course, is between Delta 100 and FP4 Plus, which is a 125 ISO film, but it's very, very close to 100. Like Ilford says, their Plus films of HP5 and FP4 have a different grain to them. So I definitely do see a more pronounced grain here and a somewhat like less sharp image in my personal experience with FP4. Now, I'm not saying that FP4 isn't a sharp looking film, but it's definitely a different look against Delta 100 if you're like really looking at them side by side. In my video about FP4, I described that film as having like a somewhat kind of like fluffy feeling look to it, and Delta 100 is definitely different from that. It's kind of like sharper and like especially for the contrast. I think you've got some added flexibility with FP4 in terms of like your exposure and what you can get away with, but I mean, I still got shots that I was happy with and like pretty easily on Delta 100. So it's not like a tricky film to use. Like it's not like a steep learning curve for like getting your exposure right. Like it's not slide film. It also has the same 100 ISO of Fuji's more expensive Acros 2 film. And I think Acros is a great looking film with a not so great price tag to it. But it gives some really interesting contrast because they claim that it has a slightly reduced red light sensitivity to it. But regardless, I think Acros stands as like probably like a sharper and like high, really professional kind of grade black and white in comparison to like Delta 100. And again, Acros, much more expensive. They do both have a similar fine grain to them though, so I think if you're looking for like that kind of look, but you're not looking to spend the kind of money on Acros, then you can probably go with something like Delta 100 and T-Max 100 because of like the grain characteristics of it. So I think Delta 100 is, of course, like a solid black and white film from Ilford. I shot a 24 exposure roll. You can also get it in 36 exposures like you can for, I believe, all the Ilford stuff. I didn't shoot it in medium format specifically for this video. I just didn't have a chance to pick up a roll, but you can get it in medium format, of course, and I'm sure sheet film as well. And as much as I did enjoy Delta 100, it does feel a little less like kind of an everyday like walking around film, and FP4 feels like a little more like that. It feels a little friendlier, I think, if that makes any sense at all. FP4 seems like a little more lighthearted and fluffy and friendly, whereas Delta 100 is more like sharp and crisp and contrast and like those characteristics. That seems like a comparison that kind of makes sense to somebody. So just be aware of the differences in characteristics between like HP5 and FP4 in comparison to Delta 100 and 400, because they do have like noticeable differences, and there's probably like pros and cons of when you would want to use them specifically for your own work. But you know, going into buying film and deciding what to shoot and when to shoot it and you know how to shoot it and what cameras you use, it is best to just like know, you know, the subtle differences across all these film stocks, because there are so many black and white film stocks out there. The grain and contrast and flexibility is something that is worth knowing when you're going to pick up these films and, you know, maybe just like accidentally using them interchangeably with like HP5 and FP4. So of course, as always, let me know your experience and like preferences and like what it comes down to for you when you're deciding between like the Plus films and the Delta films from Ilford. And thank you so much for watching. As always, subscribe and like the video and comment and, you know, talk about black and white stuff and everything, of course. You can check the description for links on the Patreon for Pro 8mm, for just like a few different things down there, as always. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon. Huge shout out to everybody over on the Patreon. Abby Henderson, Alex Onken, Elaine Sather Thomason, Amadeus Farivold, Anna Luisa Bernardez, Andrew Lieber, Benjamin MacArthur, Blake Moeller, Brian DeMartin, BW, Caleb Churchill, Carson Fuller, Carta Munir, Chalian Chris, Chaz Alling, Chris Baltiera, Chris Rohrer, Clifford Graham, Dan Gross, Dan Silvestri, Darren Martone, David Kelsey, David Piranelli, Derek Konigsberg, Django Skorupa, Emma Clyden, Frederick Kulatunga, Futigu, Gareth Tennant, Gaurav Pai, The Generation Gap Podcast, Jermaine Saez, Juliana Lepedalina, Gwen Clement, Henry and Megan, Ian Hamilton Cummings, Ian Farber, Ian Frank, Jake S. Del Mastro, James Gillespie, Jamie Maldonado, Jazz Scott, Jeremy Lee Camp, Jeremy McDonald, Jonathan Hurd, Jordan Wysong, Juan Chanko, Newt Holstrader, Landers, Larry O, Leo, Luciana Cuoto, Luke Manterfield, Lydia, Matt Bacon, Matthew Ellers, Max Goldberg, Nick Kosh, Nick Steffel, Noah Katznelson, and Flabyrinth, Orlando Perez, Ramblings from Canada, Riley Combs, RTH, Ryan Peterson, Scott Boetti, Scott Vansel, Scott Walker, Sean Williams, the Super 8 Skateboard Company, TC Johnson, Taylor Brown, Taylor Cusella, Taylor Gardner, Thomas Wibley, Tiago Almonca, Tobias Erickson, Travis Tobin, and Tykora Thomas. And an extra special thank you to those who went above and beyond on the Patreon: Carson Fuller, Chalian Chris, David Piranelli, Ian Hamilton Cummings, Taylor Brown, and the Super 8 Skateboard Company. You are all so amazing and help this to continue to be what it is.